Imagine this vivid scene. It's the scorching peak of the Maltese summer, the year 1565. You find yourself hunched low, seeking meager cover behind the splintered limestone remnants of a fort slowly succumbing to decay. Bearing down upon you, a terrifying tide of the Ottoman Janissaries, soldiers universally acknowledged as among the most formidable and feared in the world, charges relentlessly. Their formidable presence is undeniable, draped in vibrant, flowing silks and gleaming, polished steel, their throats unleashing guttural battle cries that have echoed across Europe, instilling terror for 100 years. They fully anticipate a traditional combat, expecting the glint of your sword and the familiar clang of steel on steel. Yet you do not instinctively reach for your familiar blade. Instead, your hand grasps an object that, at first glance, appears deceptively like a child's innocent plaything. It is nothing more than a simple wooden hoop, carefully wrapped in wool and thoroughly saturated in a volatile, highly flammable concoction of brandy, oil, saltpeter, and varnish. With a swift movement, you ignite it. Immediately it erupts into a furious, mesmerizing halo of blue and orange flames, a miniature sun of destruction, which you then hurl with desperate precision. The blazing hoop arcs through the sweltering air and descends with uncanny accuracy, settling perfectly over the shoulders of the leading janissary, effectively pinning his arms to his sides. His magnificent, billowing silk robes, soaked with sweat and dust, ignite in an instant, blossoming into a fiery shroud. But this initial horror is merely the prelude. As the unfortunate soldier thrashes desperately in his agony, the flaming hoop constricts, tightening its grip. The sticky, chemical inferno begins to relentlessly seep into the intricate joints and seams of his armor. He isn't just suffering from burns. He is, with unimaginable cruelty, being cooked alive within his own metallic shell, a gruesome parallel to a lobster trapped in a boiling pressure cooker. Driven by an unbearable agony, he stumbles and then sprints back into his own tightly packed ranks, a screaming, living human torch, inadvertently setting his own comrades ablaze as he collides with them. A contagion of panic, far more rapid and destructive than the spreading flames themselves, rips through the Ottoman lines. This was no mystical sorcery or dark magic. This was the brutal application of chemistry, weaponized by the sheer, desperate will to survive. This was the try-shot, an ingenious and terrifying instrument of war that dramatically leveled the seemingly insurmountable odds, transforming a hopeless fight between 8,000 beleaguered defenders and 40,000 overwhelming invaders into a possibility of survival. Prepare to confront the visceral, brutal reality of the Great Siege of Malta. Before we meticulously dissect the incredible tactical genius and the palpable madness that defined this epic conflict, if you find yourself captivated by history that transcends the dry confines of a lecture and instead plunges you into the heart of a gripping thriller, I urge you to please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. And I am genuinely curious, if you were faced with the daunting task of defending a fortress against truly impossible odds, which legendary historical commander would you unequivocally choose to lead you into battle? Share your thoughts and preferences in the comments section below. That horrifying spectacle of men engulfed in flames, their screams echoing from the ramparts of Fort St. Elmo, was far from an isolated incident. In fact, it was the grim, daily reality of a 4-month nightmare, a prolonged agony that would ultimately determine the very future of the Western world. To truly grasp why this diminutive, sun-baked island suddenly became the critical focal point of an epic global superpower struggle, we must first turn our attention to the formidable figure who dispatched those vast armies, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. By the year 1565, Suleiman had cemented his position as the undisputed master of the geopolitical chessboard, his strategic genius unmatched. His Ottoman Empire stood as an unparalleled marvel of sophisticated administration and immense military might, its dominion stretching from the ancient city of Baghdad all the way to the historic gates of Budapest. Yet, he harbored a singular, consuming obsession, a seemingly insignificant sliver of rock nestled in the heart of the Mediterranean, which he disdainfully referred to as a nest of scorpions. This was Malta, and the scorpions, inhabiting it, were the Knights of St. John. These knights represented a stubborn relic of the Crusades, an ancient order of warrior monks who had, for countless centuries, acted as an irritating, persistent thorn in the side of Islam. They were an elite fighting force, notoriously arrogant, and incredibly dangerous. Operating with the tacit approval, and indeed, the sponsorship of various states, they functioned as daring pirates, incessantly raiding crucial Ottoman shipping lanes, thereby severely disrupting the vital flow of luxurious goods and essential grain destined for Constantinople. For Suleiman, this was more than just a minor annoyance. It was a profound and deeply personal insult to his imperial authority. At the venerable age of 70, seeking a glorious capstone to his long and illustrious reign, he resolved to utterly crush them, once and for all. He assembled an immense armada, a fleet so terrifying that contemporary observers described it with awe as forests of sails, comprising nearly 200 formidable warships and a staggering complement of 40,000 troops. Among these forces were the Sipahis, his legendary and feared cavalry, and the Janissaries, the Sultan's own elite, personal death squad. Their mission was brutally clear and simple: exterminate the knights, seize Malta, and subsequently use it as an indispensable stepping stone to launch a full-scale invasion of Sicily, and eventually Rome itself. If Malta were to fall, the vulnerable, soft underbelly of Europe would be catastrophically ripped open. Defending this strategic island was Grand Master Jean de Valette. At 71 years old, he was a battle-hardened veteran, his body bearing the indelible scars of countless previous wars. He was a man defined by his unwavering resolve and zero compromise. He knew with chilling certainty that the Ottomans were coming, and he also knew, with a sinking feeling, that any potential help from Europe was highly unlikely to arrive in time. He surveyed his own meager forces, a paltry 8,000 men. The vast majority were Maltese militia, composed primarily of farmers and fishermen utterly devoid of formal combat experience. Only approximately 500 were genuine knights of the order, truly professional soldiers. The numerical discrepancy was laughably disproportionate, a crushing 5-to-1 ratio. In terms of seasoned professional soldiers, it was a far more terrifying 10-to-1. But Valette possessed two crucial advantages that the Ottomans did not. First, he commanded the immense home court advantage of Malta's notoriously brutal geography, a landscape of jagged, unforgiving rock and searing, oppressive heat that could claim a man's life as swiftly and mercilessly as a bullet. Second, he harbored the unshakable resolve of a true fanatic. Before even the first enemy sail appeared on the distant horizon, Valette sternly declared to his men, "Here we die for the faith." This was not a rousing speech, it was a stark, unvarnished statement of fact. When the immense Ottoman fleet finally arrived in May of 1565, its commanders, Mustafa Pasha and Piali Pasha, made a fatal, strategic error. They allowed their individual egos to dictate and drive their overarching strategy. Instead of bypassing the seemingly minor outlying fortifications and directly striking at the island's main capital, they became singularly fixated on a small, isolated fort guarding the crucial harbor entrance, Fort St. Elmo. It was a modest, star-shaped structure, barely substantial enough to accommodate a few hundred men. The Ottoman engineers, surveying its humble defenses, openly scoffed and laughed. They confidently estimated it would fall within a mere 3 days. They promptly brought up their monstrous basilisks, gargantuan cannons capable of firing devastating 160-pound stone balls, and commenced a relentless bombardment, pounding the fort mercilessly into dust. Day 1 passed, then Day 2, then Day 3. The walls of St. Elmo crumbled under the ceaseless onslaught, the resulting dust choking the beleaguered defenders. Yet, when the thick smoke finally cleared, the proud flag of the order was still defiantly flying. The initial 3 days stretched into a week, then into 2 weeks. The Ottomans were utterly baffled. How were these few hundred men possibly surviving such an inferno? The grim answer lay in the profound psychology of the last stand. The defenders trapped inside St. Elmo knew, with absolute certainty, that they were dead men walking. Valette had made it chillingly clear there would be no evacuation, no retreat. Their singular, agonizing job was to hold the line for as long as humanly possible and to bleed the colossal Ottoman army dry. Every single day they managed to hold out was an invaluable day the main citadels could use to strengthen and fortify their own defenses. Thus, the defenders of St. Elmo defiantly transformed the accumulating rubble into a lethal kill zone. They fought with whatever they had, with pikes, with stones, and with those terrifying, incendiary hoops. They fought shoulder to shoulder in the gaping breaches of the crumbling walls, a desperate, close-quarters melee. It was medieval warfare at its most claustrophobic, horrific, and utterly brutal. To truly comprehend how the powerful Ottomans found themselves ensnared in this nightmarish meat grinder, one must first grasp the geographical specifics of their colossal mistake. It was a blunder born purely of unchecked ego. When the vast Ottoman armada initially arrived, the two primary commanders, Mustafa and Piali, were already locked in a bitter, personal rivalry, constantly at each other's throats. Mustafa, the seasoned army general, passionately advocated for an immediate invasion of the north and a direct march on the ancient medieval capital, Medina. Piali, the shrewd admiral, conversely cared solely about the absolute safety and preservation of his precious fleet, demanding that they secure the harbor first. They ultimately compromised, and in the brutal theater of war, a compromise of this nature often proves to be a fatal death sentence. They decided to attack Fort St. Elmo. On paper, St. Elmo appeared utterly insignificant. It was merely a small, star-shaped fortification, its primary purpose to guard the narrow harbor entrance. It was never designed, nor equipped, to withstand a full-scale, sustained siege. It was barely capacious enough to house a garrison of a mere few hundred men. The Ottoman engineers scoffed at its perceived weakness, contemptuously calling it a weak lung that could be collapsed with a single breath. They were profoundly mistaken. They catastrophically failed to appreciate the intricate geometry of the kill zone it presented. St. Elmo, in fact, was constructed utilizing the cutting edge of contemporary military science. This is precisely where the ingenious star fort design truly proved its lethal genius. In a traditional, simplistic square castle, there inevitably exist numerous blind spots at the corners where defenders cannot effectively see the enemy approaching or gathered below. However, in a meticulously engineered star fort, every single wall segment is angled with deliberate precision to effectively cover the adjacent wall, thereby eliminating any potential dead zones. If an enemy soldier dared to attempt scaling one wall, they would immediately find themselves being shot in the back from another. It was a structure meticulously designed to eliminate any semblance of safe spaces for attackers. The Ottomans laboriously dragged their immense artillery pieces up the jagged, unforgiving slopes of Mount Sybaris, positioning them to look directly down upon the beleaguered fort. These were not merely ordinary cannons, they were colossal monsters of bronze. The basilisks, in particular, could hurl stone balls the terrifying size of a man's torso. When the thunderous bombardment commenced, the deafening sound was distinctly heard all the way in Sicily, an astounding distance of over 60 miles away. For the men trapped inside St. Elmo, their world was instantly transformed into a claustrophobic nightmare of perpetual dust, bone-shattering concussion, and deadly flying limestone shards. But the knights possessed a crucial secret weapon, the very stone of Malta itself. Malta is composed of a relatively soft limestone. This material possesses an inherent quality to absorb impact far better than brittle granite, which tends to shatter violently. Consequently, the walls of St. Elmo did not crack. Instead, they compacted, absorbing the relentless punishment like a sponge soaking up water. Days relentlessly turned into weeks. The Ottoman frustration mounted steadily. A grim pile of bodies in the ditch outside the fort began to rise alarmingly high, eventually becoming substantial enough to serve as a makeshift ramp for attackers. And then, the already dire situation for the beleaguered knights deteriorated further, becoming much, much worse. A ship, an unexpected arrival, sailed in from Tripoli. Stepping onto the sun-scorched shore was an 80-year-old man who commanded more profound respect and awe than even the Sultan's own leading generals. This was Dragut Reis, famously known as the Drawn Sword of Islam. He was, without question, the most feared corsair in the entire Mediterranean, a naval genius who had dedicated a lifetime to ruthlessly raiding Christian coasts. When Dragut surveyed the catastrophic blunders Mustafa and Piali had committed, specifically their folly in attacking the insignificant St. Elmo instead of focusing on the main city, he was absolutely furious. He knew, with the keen insight of a master strategist, that they had squandered precious time and invaluable ammunition on a mere diversion. However, Dragut was a pragmatist above all else. The egregious mistake had already been made. Now, he understood, he had to rectify it. He swiftly took command of the siege batteries, meticulously rearranged the cannons to optimize their firing angles, advanced the siege trenches closer to the fort, and effectively tightened the suffocating noose around St. Elmo. Under Dragut's piercing eye, the bombardment transformed from a blunt instrument into a surgical, precise operation. He didn't merely target the walls, he deliberately targeted the fragile psychology of the defenders. He ordered snipers to relentlessly watch the ramparts day and night. If a knight so much as dared to raise his visor to wipe the sweat from his eyes, a bullet would inevitably find him. Inside the fort, the conditions had become truly apocalyptic. The heat was utterly unbearable. Men were forced to fight in full-plate armor under the merciless Mediterranean summer sun, suffering from severe dehydration, deafened by the incessant explosions, and perpetually sleep-deprived. The wounded could not be evacuated effectively, and the small chapel was grimly transformed into a charnel house, overflowing with the dead and dying. Yet, every single night, under the concealing shroud of darkness, small, silent boats would expertly slip across the harbor from the main fortress of Burgu, bringing desperately needed fresh supplies and a precious handful of reinforcements to the doomed St. Elmo. Jean de Valette, with grim determination, was feeding the fire. He knew, with chilling certainty, that St. Elmo was ultimately doomed. He knew every man he dispatched there was a sacrifice, a life irrevocably lost. But he had made a cold, calculated decision. Every day St. Elmo managed to hold out was one more invaluable day for Europe to potentially send desperately needed aid, and one more day the Ottomans were forced to burn through their dwindling supplies. The defenders of St. Elmo were not fighting for victory, they were fighting for time. They were, in effect, human currency, expended by Valette to purchase survival for the rest of the order. By mid-June, Fort St. Elmo was no longer even a recognizable fortress. It was a grave without a roof. The mighty walls had been pulverized into mere mounds of limestone dust. The moat, once a formidable barrier, was now grotesquely filled with debris and the bodies of the fallen. Inside, the few surviving knights and soldiers were operating purely on raw adrenaline and fervent prayer. They were deafened by the relentless cannon fire, slowly starving, and covered in festering sores. Yet, with an almost supernatural defiance, they utterly refused to die. The Ottoman commanders simply could not fathom it. They had unleashed 18,000 cannonballs into this minuscule space. By every conceivable logic of warfare, the garrison should have surrendered weeks ago. But the Ottomans were about to suffer a crippling blow to their leadership, not from the swing of a sword, but from a cruel twist of fate. On June 18th, Dragut Reis, the legendary pirate king, the tactical genius who was systematically tightening the suffocating noose around the knights, was meticulously inspecting a siege trench. He was precisely indicating a new firing position for the cannons. Suddenly, a cannonball violently struck the rocky ground alarmingly nearby. It did not hit him directly, but the impact shattered the rock, sending fragments flying. A sharp shard of stone, acting like deadly shrapnel, sliced into Dragut's head. The drawn sword of Islam immediately fell into a coma. He would linger for several agonizing days, but the brilliant brain behind the Ottoman siege was effectively gone, rendered useless. Command regrettably fell back to Mustafa Pasha, the very man whose brute force tactics had demonstrably failed from the very start. Mustafa, driven by a desperate urgency to capture the fort before Dragut inevitably died, ordered the final, all-out assault for June 23. This was not merely a battle, it was an execution. The night before, the remaining defenders inside St. Elmo knew with chilling certainty that the end had finally come. There were no more boats silently slipping across from the main city, no more desperately needed supplies. Jean de Valette had sent his final, poignant message. You are the keys to our survival. Hold them as long as you have breath. What transpired next stands as one of the most haunting and profoundly moving scenes in all of military history. The surviving knights, fully aware they would meet their creator in the morning, solemnly gathered in the tiny chapel nestled within the ruins. They confessed their sins to one another, sought forgiveness, and shared tearful embraces. And then, the wounded, men who had tragically lost limbs, men whose bodies were terribly burned by the raging wildfire, men too weak to even stand unaided, made a heart-wrenching request. They asked to be carried to the gaping breach in the wall. They asked to be strapped into chairs, sword firmly in hand, facing the approaching enemy. If they could no longer stand to fight, they would resolutely sit to die. Dawn broke on June 23, the eve of the feast of St. John the Baptist, the revered patron saint of the order. The Ottomans attacked with every last ounce of their might. The ensuing noise was truly apocalyptic. Wave after relentless wave of Janissaries surged over the rubble. The resistance offered by the few remaining defenders was absolutely ferocious. For 4 agonizing hours, a mere handful of dying men held back an army numbering in the thousands. The knights strapped in their chairs swung their swords with dwindling strength until they were finally overwhelmed and cut down. The arquebusiers fired their primitive firearms until their barrels literally melted from the intense heat of continuous discharge. It was a frenzy of violence so utterly intense and desperate that even the Ottoman chroniclers, hardened by war, wrote of it with a shuddering, undeniable respect. But numbers ultimately are numbers. By midday, the very last defender was cut down. Fort St. Elmo had fallen. It had taken the mighty Ottoman Empire, then the greatest superpower on earth, nearly 30 brutal days, a staggering 8,000 casualties, and countless tons of precious gunpowder to capture a mere ruin defended by a few hundred men. When Mustafa Pasha finally walked into the silent, body-strewn courtyard of St. Elmo, he gazed across the harbor at the massive, towering walls of the main fortress, St. Angelo. He pointed to the smoking ruins of St. Elmo, and then to the gigantic fort across the water, and uttered a phrase that has resonated chillingly through history. Allah! If so small a son has cost us so dear, what price shall we have to pay for the father? But his momentary admiration was brutally short-lived. A surge of vengeful rage consumed him. Mustafa looked at the mutilated bodies of the knights who had humiliated him for an entire month. He yearned for revenge. He ordered the bodies of the knights to be stripped of their armor and clothing. He then had their chests cut open in the gruesome shape of a cross. Following this, he had them decapitated. He ordered their mutilated bodies to be nailed to wooden planks and then thrown into the harbor, allowing the tide to carry them across to St. Angelo as a grotesque and terrifying message to Jean de Valette. Dragut Rees, the legendary corsair, tragically died that very same day, just moments after receiving the news that the fort had finally been taken. He died believing they had won. He did not know that St. Elmo was a Pyrrhic victory, a triumph bought at an unsustainable cost. He did not know that by buying those precious 30 days, the knights had tragically pushed the siege into the deadly, sweltering heat of summer, an unforeseen ally for the defenders. Across the water, Jean de Valette watched the headless corpses of his brave brothers bobbing relentlessly in the waves. The grief within the citadel was profound, a crushing weight. But Valette, ever the strategist, did not have time for personal grief. He understood the horrific message Mustafa had sent, and now, he would grimly draft his reply. He walked purposefully to the dungeons. He did not scream. He did not cry. He simply and coldly said, "Bring me the Ottoman prisoners!" The brutal diplomacy of blood was about to commence. The waters of the Grand Harbor were still stained red with the spilled blood of St. Elmo when Jean de Valette gave his chilling order. The Ottoman prisoners were dragged roughly up to the ramparts of St. Angelo. There was no trial, no pretense of justice. There were no last rites, no comfort for their dying souls. In full and horrifying view of the Ottoman army across the water, the executioners swung their axes with grim efficiency. Heads rolled onto the blood-soaked limestone, but Valette was sending a message that transcended mere death. He ordered the severed heads to be rammed into the cannons. The gunners, with grim faces, applied the matches. With a sickening thud, the cannons fired. A gruesome rain of human remains fell upon the Ottoman lines, a visceral, unmistakable reply. The message was unequivocally received. You wanted a war of terror, now you have one. Mustafa Pasha was absolutely furious. He had taken St. Elmo, but in doing so, he had irrevocably lost the psychological war. He had harbored the twisted hope that the sight of the crucified knights would shatter the defenders' spirit. Instead, it had merely transformed them into cornered, desperate wolves. Villette, in turn, issued a stark decree: take no prisoners. From this point onward, every combatant on Malta knew with chilling certainty that surrender was merely a slower, more prolonged way to die. With St. Elmo finally gone, the Ottoman fleet could at last enter the harbor. Piali Pasha skillfully sailed his galleys into the relatively safe waters of Marsamset. Now, the massive Ottoman war machine turned its formidable attention to the two remaining Christian strongholds, the peninsulas of Singlia and Burgu. These two fortified fingers of land jutted defiantly into the harbor like a resolute peace sign. They were connected by a narrow, strategically vulnerable bridge of boats. Inside were the beleaguered civilians, the remaining knights, and the Grand Master himself. Mustafa moved his basilisks to the high ground once more. He began a bombardment so intense and relentless that it makes even modern artillery barrages seem polite in comparison. History records that there were days when not a single moment of silence could be heard from sunrise to sunset. The limestone dust was so extraordinarily thick that men coughed up white sludge, their lungs filled with pulverized rock. The civilians, men, women, and children, huddled desperately in the cellars, emerging only to bravely repair the walls under fire or to carry precious water to the dying. But then, in the suffocating thick of this despair, something truly impossible occurred, a miracle unfolding in the pervasive fog of war. For weeks, a small, desperately awaited relief force had been languishing in Sicily, paralyzed by indecision and adverse weather. It was a tiny force, comprising merely about 600 men, including a precious 42 knights. They were led by a Spanish commander, Don Melchior de Robles. Against all odds, they managed to slip past the vigilant Ottoman blockade in the dead of night, landing on the remote north coast of Malta. They then had to march silently across the island, meticulously dodging Ottoman patrols. If they had been caught, they would have been instantly slaughtered. But under the concealing cover of a thick sea mist, they ghosted undetected through the enemy lines. One morning, the defenders on the walls of Burga looked down and saw, not another terrifying wave of Janissaries, but the familiar, hopeful flag of St. George. The gates, with a triumphant creak, opened wide. The piccolo soccorso, the little relief, marched in. The city erupted in a paroxysm of joy, bells rang out wildly, and people wept openly with overwhelming relief. 600 men was certainly not an army. It was barely a battalion. Against 40,000 Ottomans, it was, numerically, a mere drop in the bucket. But psychologically it was an earthquake. It unequivocally told the beleaguered defenders, "You are not forgotten, the world is watching." Mustafa Pasha was utterly stunned. How could an enemy force simply walk into a besieged city right under his very nose? It was a profound humiliation. He realized with growing alarm that precious time was rapidly slipping away. It was now July, and the heat was becoming lethally oppressive. Disease, rampant dysentery and typhoid, was beginning to stalk the Ottoman camp, mercilessly claiming lives. The water supplies were contaminated, the food was rotting. Mustafa knew he could not afford to wait for a slow starvation. He desperately needed a knockout blow. He scrutinized the peninsula of Singlia. It was heavily guarded by Fort St. Michael, but its sea walls were conspicuously low. If he could launch a coordinated attack from both land and sea simultaneously, he believed he could crush it. He conceived a plan that was both brilliantly audacious and utterly insane. He could not sail his heavy ships into the inner harbor directly because the knights' formidable guns at St. Angelo covered the entrance. So, he did the impossible. He ordered his men to laboriously drag 80 heavy boats overland. They greased the rocks, laid down rolling logs, and physically hauled the immense ships over Mount Sybaris, dropping them into the water behind the knights' seemingly impenetrable defenses. It was a feat of engineering that rivaled the construction of the pyramids. Suddenly, the defenders of Senlia looked out in disbelief and saw an Ottoman fleet where no fleet should ever have been. Mustafa meticulously prepared his double strike. His best troops, the elite Janissaries, would attack the land walls. His amphibious commandos, meanwhile, would assault from the sea. And to lead this perilous sea attack, he chose his most fanatical warriors, the Yalas. These were men who notoriously smoked hashish before battle, scorned armor, and fought with a suicidal, berserker frenzy. The stage was set for what would become the bloodiest day of the entire siege, the Battle of the Waters, July 15th. Jean de Valette, observing grimly from his command post, saw the boats being dragged over the hill. He saw the trap closing with terrifying certainty. But he had one final, cunning card left to play, a secret defense meticulously constructed just below the waterline, a nasty surprise that would transform the harbor into a brutal slaughterhouse. July 15, 1565. The sun hadn't even fully risen when the nightmare truly began. From the ramparts of Senlia, the defenders beheld a terrifying sight. The Ottoman boats, so laboriously dragged overland the night before, were now menacingly in the water. They were packed to capacity with over 3,000 elite troops, primarily Algerian corsairs and Janissaries, men who lived and breathed for the raid. They were chanting fervent prayers, their swords drawn and glinting, heading directly for the conspicuously low sea walls of the peninsula. Simultaneously, Mustafa Pasha launched a massive land assault against the northern walls. Senlia was being squeezed in a brutal vice. The noise was absolutely deafening, cannons roaring, church bells ringing wildly, and thousands of men screaming battle cries. The amphibious force, led by the ruthless corsair Candelessa, surged relentlessly towards the shore. They fully expected to simply beach their boats and storm the walls with ease. But de Valette, always one step ahead, had not just been passively sitting in his castle praying, he had been actively building. Weeks prior, under the concealing cover of darkness, Maltese divers had diligently driven massive wooden stakes into the seabed, meticulously chained together with robust iron hoops. It was an ingenious underwater fence, a deadly palisade hidden just beneath the surface. The Ottoman boats slammed violently into this invisible barrier. With splintered, momentum was instantly halted. They were stuck, sitting ducks, 50 yards offshore, perfectly exposed to the arquebusiers positioned on the walls. What happened next utterly defies the logic of conventional warfare. Candelessa, in a fit of desperate rage, ordered his men into the water. Thousands of soldiers, without hesitation, jumped into the harbor. But the knights, displaying an audacious aggression, did not remain safely behind their walls. In a moment of supreme, desperate courage, they flung open the sally ports and charged directly into the sea, meeting the enemy head-on. The Battle of the Waters had truly begun. Imagine the sheer chaos, men in half-armor wrestling desperately with men in flowing silk tunics, submerged in waist-deep, churning water. The sea itself turned opaque with the blood of countless combatants. The Maltese militia, born and raised on this very island, proved to be the decisive, unexpected factor. They were phenomenal swimmers, at home in the water. While the Ottoman soldiers struggled clumsily with their heavy scimitars and waterlogged robes, the agile Maltese swam deftly around them with their knives, mercilessly pulling them under, slitting their throats, and dragging them to the bottom. It was primal, a visceral, hand-to-hand struggle for survival. It wasn't a battle of grand formations, it was a brutal drowning contest. But the immediate threat was far from over. A second wave of Ottoman boats, carrying crucial reserves, 10 large vessels packed with fresh Janissaries, spotted a perceived weak point. They saw a section of the wall at the base of Fort St. Angelo that appeared undefended. If they could land there, they believed they could effectively flank the knights and bring the entire siege to an immediate, decisive end. They steered their boats confidently toward this perceived gap. They cheered, convinced they had discovered the backdoor to ultimate victory. They were gravely mistaken. They were sailing directly into the crosshairs of the single greatest trap of the entire siege. De Valette, with his unparalleled foresight, had anticipated this exact move. Hidden strategically at the waterline, camouflaged meticulously behind a low wall, was a battery of 5 heavy cannons. It was commanded by the Chevalier de Girolles, who had given his gunners strict orders to hold their fire, to wait patiently, to let the enemy get perilously close. The Ottoman boats drifted closer, 200 yards, then 100 yards, then a mere 50 yards. They were so incredibly close that the gunners could vividly see the whites of their eyes. Then de Girolles dropped his hand, a silent signal. All 5 cannons fired simultaneously, unleashing a devastating volley. They were loaded with grapeshot, bags filled with iron nails, chains, and musket balls. The effect was akin to a gigantic shotgun blast at point-blank range. The result was absolute, instantaneous annihilation. 9 of the 10 boats were shattered instantly, exploding into splinters. Hundreds of men were shredded before they even registered they were dead. The water simply erupted in a geyser of red foam and wood splinters. There were no survivors to retreat, no witnesses to recount the horror. The reserve force of the Ottoman attack simply ceased to exist in a fraction of a second. Back at Senlia, seeing their crucial reinforcements utterly vaporized, the morale of the attackers collapsed catastrophically. The knights and the Maltese, seizing the moment, pushed forward relentlessly, driving the surviving Ottomans back into the sea. Candelessa, the once great corsair commander, fled ignominiously in a small boat, abandoning his men to be slaughtered. By noon, the water around Senlia was so choked with corpses that it was grimly said you could walk on the dead without getting your feet wet. The Ottomans had lost nearly 4,000 of their best shock troops in a single morning. The knights, miraculously, had lost barely 200. Mustafa Pasha watched the unfolding disaster from the hill, his face etched with disbelief. He had played his best card, a surprise amphibious assault, and it had been decisively trumped by a hidden battery and a simple wooden fence. The victory was euphoric for the defenders. They believed, for a precious moment, that they had won the war. They thought the Ottomans would pack up and leave in defeat. But they were profoundly mistaken. Mustafa Pasha was not a man who quit. He was a man who got even. He realized he couldn't take the forts by trickery. He couldn't take them by storm. So he resolved to do the one thing the Ottomans did better than anyone else in history. He would erase the forts from the map, inch by agonizing inch. The war of nerves was over. The brutal war of attrition had just begun. August in Malta is not just a season, it is a weapon unto itself. The relentless sun beats down mercilessly on the white limestone until the rock itself seems to radiate heat like an inferno. By August 1565, the Great Siege had tragically devolved into a slow, suffocating hallucination. The fleeting euphoria of the swimmers' battle had long since evaporated. The water was gone, the wells were either dry or brackish and undrinkable. The defenders were reduced to drinking vinegar mixed with filthy water. Bread was desperately scarce, and the pervasive smell, the putrid stench of thousands of unburied bodies rotting in the ditch, baking under the merciless sun, hung over the island like a poisonous, suffocating fog. Mustafa Pasha had abandoned any pretense of cleverness. He ceased the amphibious tricks. Instead, he unleashed the basilisks on a brutal 24-hour rotation. Day and night, the walls of Birgu and Senlia were pounded relentlessly. But the true, insidious danger wasn't merely coming from the sky, it was ominously coming from below. The Ottomans were master engineers, unsurpassed in siegecraft. They began to dig. Thousands of sappers tunneled tirelessly through the solid rock, inching their way methodically under the walls of the bastion of Castile, which was the strongest point of the knights' entire defense. Their sinister goal was to plant a massive charge of gunpowder, a mine that would literally blow the formidable walls sky-high from their very foundations. The knights valiantly attempted to countermine. They dug their own tunnels with frantic urgency to intercept the Ottomans, leading to terrifying, claustrophobic underground skirmishes where men fought desperately with knives and pickaxes in total, suffocating darkness, crammed into tiny holes hundreds of feet underground. But they tragically missed one. On August 18th, just after noon, while the Grand Master and the knights were at prayer, their world dramatically ended. A massive, earth-shattering explosion ripped through the bastion of Castile. The ground shook violently enough to knock men off their feet. A huge section of the main wall simply disintegrated, vanishing in a terrifying cloud of dust and smoke. Before the dust even had a chance to settle, the piercing Ottoman war cry ripped through the air. Through the gaping, smoking hole in the wall, a sea of Janissaries poured in, an unstoppable torrent. They were fresh, well-fed, and smelled the intoxicating scent of victory. The defenders, utterly stunned and blinded by the blast, began to waver. The line was visibly breaking. Panic, that insidious virus that invariably kills armies, began to spread like wildfire. The knights started to retreat desperately toward the inner safety of Fort St. Angelo. It was the moment the siege should have irrevocably ended. But Jean de Valette was not in the relative safety of the inner keep. He was in the chapel of St. Lawrence, deep in prayer. When the deafening explosion hit, he didn't pause to ask for a status report. He didn't summon his generals. Instead, he grabbed a helmet and a pike, his face set with grim determination. This is the enduring image that, perhaps, saved Europe, a 71-year-old man, limping from an old leg wound, running directly towards the epicenter of the explosion. His stunned commanders screamed desperately at him. "Sire, retreat to the citadel! The town is lost! Save yourself!" Valette, deaf to their pleas, ignored them completely. He charged straight into the breach, scrambling over the treacherous rubble, throwing himself fearlessly into the furious melee against the oncoming wave of Janissaries. He wasn't directing the battle from afar. He was inextricably in the battle, fighting alongside his men. Seeing their Grand Master, an old man they revered as a father figure, fighting hand to hand with a simple pike, the retreating knights suddenly stopped dead in their tracks. Shame, a far more powerful emotion than fear, replaced their panic. If the old man was going to die there, they would have to die with him. The disorganized retreat instantly transformed into a furious countercharge. The knights and the Maltese civilians, including women carrying stones and children carrying precious water, rushed the breach. It was a chaotic, desperate scrum on top of a treacherous pile of loose rocks. Valette was grievously wounded in the leg by a grenade splinter, but he vehemently refused to be carried away. He pointed his sword defiantly at the breach and bellowed, "I will not withdraw so long as those banners wave in the wind," referring to the Ottoman flags that had already been planted triumphantly on the ruins. For hours, the brutal battle raged relentlessly in the gap. It was pure attrition, devoid of tactics, just endless stabbing and crushing. Finally, utterly exhausted and unnerved by the sheer ferocity of the counterattack, the Ottomans fell back. The breach was held, but only just. That night, the knights earnestly begged Valette to sleep in the safety of Fort St. Angelo. He staunchly refused. He ordered his bed to be moved to the breach itself. He slept there, on the hard rocks under the open sky, precisely where the enemy would inevitably attack next. He knew, with a chilling clarity, that his physical presence alone was the only thing holding the crumbling walls and the rapidly crumbling morale of his men together. Mustafa Pasha was absolutely apoplectic. He had blown the wall, he had the city seemingly within his grasp, and he had been shamefully pushed back by a geriatric man with a pike. Desperation, a corrosive force, began to set in on both sides, but Mustafa had one more horror to unleash. If he couldn't break their walls with gunpowder, and he couldn't break their spirits with fear, he would break their bodies with disease. He ordered the corpses of his own dead soldiers to be deliberately cut open and then thrown into the Grand Harbor's only remaining water source, a monstrous act of biological warfare. Biological warfare had officially arrived. But as the Ottomans prepared for their final, decisive push, a whisper began to circulate through their camp, a rumor, almost a ghost story. Soldiers looked nervously at the northern horizon. Winter, with its treacherous gales, was coming, and with the changing winds, something else, something potentially devastating, was also approaching. By the end of August, the very concept of victory had completely vanished for the knights. Their desperate goal was no longer to win, it was simply to delay the inevitable for just one more agonizing hour. The walls of Birgu and Senlia were practically gone, reduced to rubble. The defenders were sleepwalking, fighting in a trance-like state brought on by relentless starvation and continuous, exhausting combat. Mustafa Pasha, sensing the kill, prepared for it. He launched a total, overwhelming assault on both fortresses simultaneously. It was the largest attack of the entire siege, a desperate all-or-nothing gamble. Every remaining Ottoman soldier was thrown mercilessly at the walls. The sheer, overwhelming weight of numbers began to push the knights back, inexorably. The line was bending, visibly straining. The Ottoman flags were once again being triumphantly planted on the parapets. This, truly, was it, the bitter, final end of the Order of St. John. And then, the impossible happened. Just as the Ottoman soldiers were about to break through into the city streets, a trumpet sounded, piercingly, from their rear. Confused orders began to ripple through the Ottoman ranks. Retreat! Retreat! The knights, blood-soaked and disbelieving, were utterly baffled. They looked up from their desperate positions and saw, inexplicably, the backs of the Janissaries. The mighty Ottoman army, on the very brink of total victory, was turning around and running back towards their camp. The defenders did not cheer, they simply stared, dumbfounded. It was a miracle, but it wasn't divine intervention. It was, rather, a profound mistake. To understand this unexpected miracle, we must turn our gaze inland to the old medieval capital of Malta, Mdina. Mdina sits majestically on a high plateau in the very center of the island, miles away from the harbor's chaos. Throughout the siege, the Ottomans had largely ignored it, considering it strategically irrelevant. Inside Mdina was a small garrison of cavalry, led by the Portuguese knight, Mesquita. They had been watching the columns of smoke rise from the harbor for months, frustrated and powerless. On that fateful day, as Mustafa emptied his camp to launch the final, decisive assault, the cavalry in Mdina looked down and saw an extraordinary opportunity. The sprawling Ottoman camp, a veritable city of tents, vital supplies, and makeshift hospitals, was left almost completely unguarded. The cavalry charged. It wasn't a large force, but they hit the camp with the pent-up fury of men who had been caged and helpless for 3 long months. They didn't target the soldiers directly, they targeted the infrastructure, the very lifeblood of the siege. They slaughtered the few sentries, set fire to the crucial supply tents, and in a grim, brutal act of war, they attacked the Ottoman field hospital, mercilessly killing hundreds of sick and wounded soldiers. From the front lines at the harbor, miles away, Mustafa Pasha and his troops saw thick, ominous columns of black smoke rising from their own base camp. They heard the distant screams, carried chillingly on the wind. Panic, indeed, is a powerful hallucinogen. Mustafa didn't think clearly. It's a small raid, he foolishly thought. No, the Spanish have arrived. He immediately assumed that a massive European relief army had landed, somehow bypassed the harbor, and was now ruthlessly destroying his rearguard. Terrified of being trapped between the knights in the fort and a fresh, overwhelming army in his camp, Mustafa frantically sounded the retreat. He pulled his men back from the very brink of victory to save his base. When he arrived at the camp, breathless and mentally prepared for a massive battle, he found nothing but burning tents, dead wounded, and hoof prints leading back to Mdina. The ghost army had vanished as quickly as it appeared. The realization must have been sickening. Mustafa had abandoned a guaranteed victory to chase a phantom. He had been played, manipulated. His rage was boundless, uncontrollable. He immediately ordered an assault on Mdina to crush the insolent cavalry, but his troops were utterly exhausted, their spirit broken. They flatly refused. The morale of the Ottoman army, which had been chipping away for months, finally cracked completely. They were tired. They were sick. The Maltese curse, dysentery, was ravaging the ranks. Supplies were critically low because the cavalry had just burned them. And now, ominously, the weather began to turn. The first storms of September rolled in. The wind changed direction drastically. For the Ottoman fleet, this was a living nightmare. If the treacherous winter gales started, their galleys would be trapped in the Mediterranean, unable to sail back to the safety of Constantinople. Piali Pasha, the admiral, began to argue openly and vehemently with Mustafa. He desperately wanted to leave. Inside the fortress, Jean de Valette saw the hesitation. He observed the furious arguments in the enemy camp. He knew the tide had irrevocably turned, but he also knew his own situation was still critically dire. His walls were rubble. His ammunition was almost completely gone. He played one final, audacious gamble, a psychological trick to utterly break the Ottoman spirit. A Muslim slave had been captured trying to escape. Instead of executing him, Valette treated him with unexpected kindness. He allowed the slave to see the garrison, but it was a meticulously staged performance. Valette ordered his starving men to put on their best armor. He laid out the last of the food on tables as if they had plenty, a deceptive feast. He acted confident, even arrogant. Then, he released the slave back to the Ottoman camp. The slave, unwittingly, reported to Mustafa, "They are not starving. They have food, they are strong, and they are waiting for you." It was a lie, a total fabrication, but in the pervasive fog of war, perception is reality. Mustafa hesitated, and in that agonizing moment of hesitation, the horizon changed again. This time, the sails on the distant sea were not Ottoman. For 4 agonizing months, Jean de Valette had been scanning the northern horizon, his hopes slowly dwindling. Every sunrise brought the same empty, unforgiving blue sea. The promise of help from the Viceroy of Sicily, Don Garcia de Toledo, had become a bitter joke among the starving defenders. They called it warfare. Always tomorrow, never today. But on the glorious morning of September 7, 1565, the horizon finally broke. It started as a murmur on the walls of Medina, then swelled into a triumphant shout, and finally, a deafening roar that reached the shattered ruins of Birgu. Sails. Not the crescent moon of the Ottoman, but the proud red cross of the Spanish Empire. The Gran Soccorso, the Great Relief, had arrived. It was a formidable fleet of 28 galleys carrying a fresh complement of 8,000 men. These weren't just any soldiers. These were the Turcos of the Spanish infantry, widely considered the most feared, disciplined, and lethally effective fighting force in Europe at the time. They were fresh, they were well-fed, and they were incandescently angry. They had spent months waiting impatiently in Sicily, hearing harrowing stories of the atrocities committed at St. Elmo. They were itching for a fight. The fleet did not sail directly into the Grand Harbor. That would have been suicide. Instead, they landed further north at St. Paul's Bay. The disembarkation was frantic, a surge of adrenaline. The soldiers jumped into the surf, dragging their pikes and arquebuses onto the rocky shore. They didn't wait for heavy baggage or artillery, they just wanted to march, to engage. Back at the Grand Harbor, the reaction in the Ottoman camp was pure, unadulterated chaos. The sight of the relief fleet shattered what little morale was left. The rumors flew wildly, morphing into terrifying exaggerations. "It's an army of 20,000! It's the entire might of Europe!" Mustafa Pasha, utterly exhausted, profoundly humiliated, made the only decision that seemed logical in his state. He ordered a retreat. The siege was, at long last, over. For the next 24 hours, the scene was apocalyptic. The Ottoman army, which had arrived with such pomp and circumstance in May, was now a disorganized mob scrambling desperately to get onto the ships. They abandoned their heavy cannons, their tents, even some of their sick and wounded. The defenders inside Birgu and Senlia, too weak to pursue them, simply watched from the walls, weeping openly with an overwhelming, profound relief. The bells of the churches, which had been silent for months for fear of attracting artillery fire, now began to ring out triumphantly, a joyous peal of victory. But the tragedy of the Great Siege had one final, bloody act to play. As the Ottoman troops were boarding their ships, Mustafa Pasha received crucial intelligence from a deserter. He learned the shocking truth: the relief force wasn't 20,000 men, it was only 8,000. Mustafa, doing the rapid math, realized with a jolt of renewed pride that even after all his losses, he still had approximately 15,000 fighting men left. He still outnumbered the Christians nearly 2-1. His pride, battered and bruised, flared up for one last, desperate time. He realized that if he returned to Constantinople with his tail between his legs, fleeing from a smaller force, the Sultan might very well have him executed. So, he made a fatal error, a decision born of ego and fear. He stopped the evacuation. He ordered his exhausted, demoralized troops to get off the ships, to disembark once more. He ordered them to march inland to confront the Spanish relief force. It was, effectively, a death sentence. The two armies met on a ridge near Nakshar. On one side, the Ottomans, tired, sick, disheartened, dragged back into a war they thought was decisively over. On the other side, the Spanish relief force, fresh, fully armored, and burning with intense religious zeal. Don Garcia, the Spanish commander, tried desperately to organize his men into proper formations, wishing to fight a tactical, disciplined battle. But the soldiers, consumed by rage, ignored him completely. When they saw the Ottomans, the very men who had so brutally butchered the knights at St. Elmo, they simply lost all control. The Spanish charge wasn't a maneuver, it was a riot, a spontaneous explosion of fury. The knights of the relief force, seeing the despised redcoats of the Janissaries, broke ranks and sprinted uphill, their rage unadulterated and primal. The collision was brutal but mercifully short. The Ottoman lines, brittle and fractured from months of failure, shattered on impact. The invincible Janissaries, who had terrified Europe for a century, broke and ran in disarray. The retreat instantly turned into a rout, a full-blown stampede. The Spanish and the Maltese chased them relentlessly all the way back to St. Paul's Bay. It was a slaughter. The Ottoman soldiers, desperate to escape the Spanish steel, threw themselves into the sea, trying to swim to their waiting galleys. The water once again turned red with blood. Mustafa Pasha himself barely escaped, dragged onto a boat by his loyal bodyguards while the battle raged ferociously in the surf behind him. As the last Ottoman galley rowed away, leaving thousands of their own dead floating in the bay, a profound silence finally returned to Malta. It was September 11th. The oppressive heat broke. The first cleansing rains of autumn began to fall, mercifully washing the blood from the rocks. Inside Burgu, Jean de Valette did not celebrate. He walked slowly through the desolate ruins of his city. He looked at the few surviving knights, men who were mere skeletons in dented, battered armor. Out of the 8,000 defenders who had stood bravely on the walls in May, only a paltry 600 were still capable of holding a weapon. They had won, yes, but the island was a graveyard. The pervasive smell of death was everywhere. The greatest siege in history was over, but the cost was a generation of men and a landscape reduced to dust. When the Ottoman fleet finally limped back into the Golden Horn of Constantinople, the ships were painted black in mourning, a somber testament to their defeat. They had left in May as the armada of a god, resplendent and invincible. They returned in October as a battered convoy of ghosts, their grand ambitions shattered. Suleiman the Magnificent, the powerful emperor who had terrified the world for 46 years, sat on his throne and listened to the grim report. He was furious, his rage palpable. He threw the dispatch to the floor in disgust. For the very first time in his illustrious life, the shadow of God on earth had been eclipsed, his invincibility questioned. He is famously recorded to have stared out at the Bosphorus and muttered, with a tone of bitter resignation, "My armies triumph only when I lead them." He immediately ordered preparations for a new, even grander invasion the following year. He swore he would lead it himself and grind Malta into dust once and for all. But history, with its own inexorable plans, had other ideas. Before the next summer arrived, Suleiman the Magnificent would be dead, passing away on a campaign in Hungary. The illusion of the Ottoman Empire's invincibility had tragically died with him on the rock of Malta. The spell was broken. Europe, collectively, breathed a sigh of profound relief for the first time in decades. Back on the island, the silence was deafening, a stark contrast to the months of thunderous battle. Jean de Valette walked through the ravaged streets of Burgu. It wasn't a city anymore. It was a skeleton, a haunting testament to the devastation. The smell of death was so pervasive, so deeply ingrained, that the few survivors had to burn aromatic herbs in the streets just to breathe without gagging. The cost of victory was utterly staggering. Of the 8,000 men who had bravely stood on the walls in May, barely 600 were left standing, most of them wounded or frail. The knights had tragically lost a third of their esteemed order. The Maltese population had been decimated, countless lives lost. But amidst this profound devastation, de Valette made a decision that would not only define the future of Malta but profoundly shape the destiny of the entire Mediterranean. He looked across the harbor to the barren, rocky ridge of Mount Sybaris, the very high ground where the relentless Ottoman cannons had fired from, the place where St. Elmo had heroically fallen. His weary generals told him to simply rebuild the old forts, to restore what was lost. Valette, with visionary foresight, said no. He pointed to that high ridge and declared, "We will build a new city there, a city built by gentlemen for gentlemen." On March 28, 1566, barely 6 months after the siege, de Valette personally laid the foundation stone. He didn't just build a fortress, he built a masterpiece of military architecture, an urban marvel. He hired the finest engineers in Europe, men of unparalleled skill. They meticulously sliced the top off the mountain to level the ground, creating a formidable plateau. They designed an ingenious grid system for the streets, deliberately angled to allow the sea breeze to act as natural air conditioning, a testament to thoughtful urban planning. They built walls so astonishingly thick and high that they remain, even today, some of the most impressive and impregnable fortifications on earth. He named the city after himself, Humilissima Civitas Valte, the most humble city of Valletta. It was anything but humble. It was a powerful, defiant statement. It was a giant middle finger, forged from limestone, pointing south towards Africa and east towards Constantinople. It proclaimed, with silent, enduring strength, "We are still here, and we are not going anywhere." Donations poured in from every monarch in Europe, a torrent of gold and resources. Kings who had shamefully ignored Valette's desperate pleas for help before the siege now sent chests of gold, terrified that the Ottomans might return. The Pope sent his best engineers. Philip of Spain sent a jeweled sword, a symbol of honor. But Jean de Valette would never live to see his magnificent city finished. He died in 1568, just 3 years after the siege, from a stroke, most likely brought on by the sheer exhaustion of the war and a strenuous hunting trip in the unforgiving summer heat. He was buried in the crypt of St. John's Co-Cathedral, right in the heart of the majestic city that proudly bears his name. When they laid him to rest, the inscription on his tomb didn't list his numerous titles or his noble lineage. It simply, yet profoundly, read, "Here lies Valette, worthy of eternal honor, he who was the shield of Europe." The Great Siege was over, but its profound legacy was just beginning. Because the story of Malta didn't conclude in 1565. The formidable fortifications built by the knights would be tested again and again throughout history. From Napoleon's grand ambitions to the relentless Luftwaffe in World War II, Malta would remain the most bombed, besieged, and fiercely contested rock in all of history. Today, if you are fortunate enough to visit Malta, you will behold a country that appears to have been carved entirely from a single, magnificent block of gold. The ancient limestone walls of Valletta still glow with an ethereal beauty in the sunset, towering majestically over the grand harbor. You can walk the very streets laid out by the visionary Jean de Valette himself. You can touch the indelible scars etched onto the walls of Fort St. Angelo, silent witnesses to centuries of conflict. But there is a crucial detail on the Maltese flag that tells the true, deeper story. In its top corner, there is a small silver cross. It's not the distinctive 8-pointed cross of the Knights. It's the George Cross, the highest British award for civilian bravery. It was bestowed upon the entire island of Malta in 1942. Why? Because history has a terrifying, relentless habit of repeating itself. Nearly 400 years after the Great Siege, Malta found itself alone again, facing existential threats. This time, the implacable enemy wasn't the Ottoman Empire, it was Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. The weapons weren't gleaming scimitars and monstrous basilisks. They were devastating Stuka dive bombers and insidious U-boats. But the underlying logic was exactly the same. Whoever controls Malta controls the Mediterranean, the vital artery of empire. In World War II, Malta became, by grim necessity, the most bombed place on Earth. For 2 brutal years, the island was hammered with more explosives than London endured during the Blitz. The people starved. They lived, once again, in the same limestone tunnels their brave ancestors had dug centuries before. And just like in 1565, they utterly refused to surrender. The indomitable spirit of Jean de Valette, it seemed, had seeped into the very groundwater of the island, becoming an intrinsic part of its people. The Great Siege of 1565 truly matters because it is the ultimate underdog story, a timeless tale of resilience against overwhelming odds. It shatters the pervasive myth that numbers alone win wars. It powerfully proves that technology, ingenious geography, and resolute leadership are formidable force multipliers. But the most dangerous weapon of all, the most potent and enduring, is the unbreakable human will to survive, to defy. Jean de Valette and his knights were not perfect men, they were, in truth, a complex mix of pirates, aristocrats, and religious zealots. But for one long, bloody summer, they stood defiantly on a rock and held back the relentless tide of history. They bought Europe invaluable time, a second chance. They proved unequivocally that the inevitable victory of a superpower is only inevitable if you, the underdog, stop fighting. When you look at the map of the world today, observing its constantly shifting borders, its empires that have risen and then turned to dust, you see the profound impact. The Ottoman Empire is gone. The Spanish Empire is gone. The Order of St. John has gracefully evolved from a fearsome military machine into a global humanitarian charity. But the walls remain, silent and steadfast. They stand as a silent, enduring testament to the 8,000 resolute men who looked at 40,000 overwhelming invaders and simply said, with unwavering conviction, "No further." So, the next time you feel utterly overwhelmed, the next time the odds are stacked impossibly against you and the cold math dictates that you should quit, remember the headless knights of St. Elmo. Remember the brave swimmers fighting desperately in the red-stained waters of St. Leah. Remember the old man, wounded yet resolute, running fearlessly into the breach with a pike. History, after all, is not written by the big battalions. It is written by those indomitable few who absolutely refuse to leave the field. If you've thoroughly enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most brutal and pivotal sieges, please make sure you're subscribed to our channel. We have so many more forgotten stories to uncover, from the frozen wastelands of Russia to the humid jungles of Vietnam. Hit the bell icon so you don't miss the next critical deployment of historical narrative. And I have a thought-provoking question for you to answer in the comments below. Do you truly believe the Knights would have won if Dragut Reyes hadn't been tragically killed? Or was the Ottoman defeat ultimately inevitable due to their inherent logistical overreach and strategic blunders? I'll be down there, eager to debate these fascinating historical points with you. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next compelling chapter of history.